Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I'm a researcher studying psychology, neuroscience, physics, and philosophy. And today we're going to be talking about the science of beauty. So, I gave a lecture at the Art Gallery of Hamilton on this topic about a month ago, and I tried to film it, but the filming didn't work for a couple of reasons. So I'm just going to be walking you through the lecture here. Um, so as you'll see, in this lecture, I talk about how neuroscience and physics allow us to understand what art actually is, and it also allows us to derive some properties of good art or beautiful art. Okay, and this I think is rather interesting because if you look at the philosophy of aesthetics, um, a lot of people are of the opinion that beauty is entirely subjective. However, as I'll show in this lecture, that is not the case. Okay, there are qualities that beautiful pieces of art have, and these qualities are rooted in how the brain works and also the laws of physics. Okay, so let's just jump into it. So the science of beauty. So in this video, in this lecture, we're going to be answering four questions. What is the value of artistic expression? Can beauty be described scientifically? What makes something beautiful? And how are love and beauty related? In order to answer these questions, we have to look at a bit of a literature review in terms of the purpose of artistic expression and also something Abraham Maslow discovered known as rhapsodic communication. After that, we'll be able to dive into a scientific description of beauty, elements of true beauty, and also I'll talk briefly about love and beauty. Although, when it comes to the topic of love, I think I might break that out into a separate video. But anyway, let's just dive into it. So, the purpose of artistic expression. Okay, like what is art for? In order to answer this question, I started off by going to artists and seeing what artists themselves had to say about why they made art. So the first person that I'm citing here is Ursula K. Le Guin, who is a science fiction writer. And she says, essentially, that art describes reality. She says the purpose of a thought experiment is not to predict the future, but to describe reality. Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. Okay, so essentially what Ursula K. Le Guin is saying is the science fiction novels she writes, they're not entirely about like a future world. She's using the medium of science fiction to describe things in our world that she thinks are important. Okay, and I think that's rather interesting. She's using science fiction and fiction in general to describe the real world. Okay. Now the second artist that I went to is the philosopher and fiction writer Ayn Rand. So a few decades ago, Ayn Rand wrote her philosophy of art in a book called The Romantic Manifesto. And this is what she said. Art is a concretization of metaphysics. Art brings man's concepts to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allows him to grasp them directly as if they were percepts. Okay, so what she's saying is that art allows you to take concepts, okay, and put those in a painting, put those concepts in a song or a story, okay, and allows us to perceive those concepts, okay, which is rather interesting. Because typically when we talk about concepts, we have to write extended philosophical books on them and we have very abstract discussions. And so when it comes to art, it allows us to take those concepts and make them concrete. Okay, so Ayn Rand goes on to say that the arts do not deal with the sensory field of awareness, but with the sensory field as perceived by a conceptual awareness. The sensory perceptual awareness of an adult does not consist of mere sense data, but of automatic integrations that combine sense data with a vast context of conceptual knowledge. The visual arts refine and direct the sensory elements of these integrations. By means of emphasis and omission, these arts lead man's sight to the conceptual context intended by the artist. They teach man to see more precisely and to find deeper meaning in the world. Okay, so what is Ayn Rand saying here? She's saying that the things that we perceive through sight or hearing or whatever, okay, we take those that sensory data and integrate it with what's already in our minds. Okay, and art is the artist's way of communicating what's in their mind. Okay, they choose to emphasize certain things or omit certain things to direct people's attention in a similar way that their own attention is directed. Okay, so let's say a photographer takes a picture. Okay, that picture is emphasizing certain things. That picture has a certain focus. Okay, and seeing the picture allows you essentially to see through the artist's eyes, the photographer's eyes. It allows you to see what they're focusing on. It allows you to see what they consider relevant, worthy of emphasis. Okay, and paintings are the same way. Musical lyrics and poems are the same way. Okay, you're taking concepts and worldviews and putting them into an art form. Okay, and so I've made a little bit of a diagram here when it comes to the purpose of art. Okay, so typically we have things that we can communicate verbally. Okay, and then one layer below that in our consciousness, we have concepts such as ideas or thoughts. Okay, and then below that, we have what I call preconceptual knowledge, which are emotions and vibes. These are subconscious and often difficult to describe. Okay, anyone who's been to therapy or coaching or anything like that, and the therapist says like, well, how do you feel about that? And why do you feel that way? It can be really challenging to explain like, oh wait, like I guess I'm feeling anger right now or sadness. And then you have to think about like why you're feeling sad. Okay? And so what's happening in those kinds of therapeutic interactions is the therapist is helping people draw their own attention to preconceptual knowledge. Things that aren't even fully concepts yet. They're like emotions and vibes and feelings and so on. Okay? And getting you to like talk about them. Now that is typically really, really challenging to do. However, art is kind of like a bridge between all of these domains. Okay? Art allows people to express emotions in interesting ways. It allows them to express concepts in interesting ways. And you don't always have to do it through words. So effectively what art does is it expands the range of communication beyond things that we can just put into words. Okay, if someone is feeling a certain way, they can paint, they can write a song. Okay, and the chord progressions and the colors and so on allows them to express their feelings in a way that they might not always be able to put into words. Okay, so that's kind of the purpose of art. Okay, it expands our range of communication beyond things that we can just say explicitly with our mouth. And it also allows us to communicate not just concepts, but also emotions in an efficient way. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. And this isn't just me saying it. The famous psychologist Abraham Maslow, in his work, he came up with something called rhapsodic communication. So this is what he had to say. In trying to elicit reports of peak experiences from subjects, I evolved a different kind of interview procedure without being consciously aware that I had done so. The rhapsodic communication, as I've called it, consists of a kind of emotional contagion. It may have considerable implications for both the theory of science and the philosophy of education. I was learning to shift over more and more to figures of speech, metaphors, similes, and in general, to use more and more poetic speech. It turns out that these are often apt to click, to touch off an echoing experience, a parallel vibration, than there are sober, cool, carefully descriptive phrases. This showed me that the word ineffable means not communicable by words that are analytic, abstract, or exact. Poetic and metaphorical language, things found in dreams, reveries, and the arts, all of these are better at communicating certain aspects of the ineffable. So, in his psychological research, Abraham Maslow came to very similar conclusions. Poetic speech, artistic speech, okay, even though it was still words, communicating in a more poetic and artistic way allowed for what he described as emotional contagion, okay, which is taking the pre-conceptual and conceptual layers of our consciousness and communicating those to another human being. Okay, so that kind of reinforces what I was saying earlier in terms of art expanding our range of possible communication. Okay, it's not just about making pretty things. It's not just about making nice music. It's about communicating emotions, vibes, concepts, worldviews, perspectives. Okay, things that would otherwise be inefficient or difficult to put into words, we can communicate those things through art. Okay, and so when it comes to summarizing the purpose of artistic expression, first of all, it allows us to express concepts and emotions that are hard to discuss in words. It also makes the world a more enjoyable and beautiful place. And it allows us to connect with our deepest and preconceptual selves. So, during my life, I've had the opportunity to interact at length in a coaching capacity with a number of people who had borderline personality disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, that's just been part of my life journey. And it just so happens that when I look back on all of those interactions, I've realized that a lot of people with CPTSD or BPD, they will use music to understand their own emotions. Okay, so they're feeling emotions. They don't necessarily even know what those emotions are or why they're having them. But figuring out, like, okay, this song expresses how I feel. Like, I connect with that song. Okay? And teenagers will do this as well, by the way. Right? Like, Pink Floyd's The Wall is one example where a lot of people gravitate towards that album for various reasons. Okay? And usually it's because it's like, okay, the things that they're expressing in that album, okay, it connects with me. Like, it's helping me understand my own emotions. Okay? So art is not just about communicating what's in the artist's mind. It's also facilitating connection within the audience in terms of helping them connect with themselves. Yeah, this song really speaks to me. This song, yeah, I identify with this song. That is how I feel. Okay, so that's like a really big value of art in is that it helps people connect to themselves. Okay, it helps the artist communicate, but it also helps the audience connect to themselves. Okay. And so now with that covered, we can talk about a scientific description of beauty. Okay, so when I talk about the science of beauty, okay, it's like, what exactly do I mean by that? And how could I have possibly come to the conclusions that I've come to? Okay, like, for decades, if not centuries, our art and beauty has been seen as kind of this subjective thing. It's hard to explain scientifically. So what makes me think that I've been able to crack the code on this? Okay, and the short answer is that I use a unique methodology, which was developed over the last few decades, actually, which is known as consilience. Okay, so consilience is defined as an agreement between the approaches to a topic of different academic subjects, especially science and the humanities. Okay, so essentially, if science is saying one thing and the humanities are saying a very similar thing, the intersection of those agreements is known as consilience. Okay? And what I look for typically in any of my scholarship is areas of agreement between different fields of study. Okay, so like as a psychology researcher, if positive psychology is saying something, developmental psychology is saying the same thing in a different way, and neuroscience is saying the same thing in a different way, that area of agreement is very, very likely to be a fact. Okay, because different methods of study are all converging on the same thing. Okay, and so what I'm looking for when it comes to the science of beauty is areas of convergence. Where is science saying the same thing as the philosophy of aesthetics? Okay, and I've already done this in this video. Okay, when I cited Ursula K. Le Guin, that's art. She's a science fiction writer. Ayn Rand is primarily a philosopher, and Abraham Maslow is a psychologist. And all three of them were saying the same thing, is that art allows people to communicate things that are difficult to put into words. It allows them to describe their worldview, their perspective on reality, and communicate that to other people. And it also allows them to communicate emotions. Okay? All three of these people, artists, philosophers, and scientists, were all saying the same thing. Okay? That's consilience. That's consilience. And so when it comes to how I came to the conclusions that I'm going to share with you, this is what I did. Okay? I looked at themes in the philosophy of aesthetics, and then I looked into science to figure out if there were discoveries or laws that were very, very similar. Then I looked at the common function between what aesthetics and science were saying, and from that I abstracted the real relation, the underlying theme. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start out with the diagram that I constructed here, where art is a bridge between the preconceptual, conceptual, and expressible domains of consciousness. Okay, so we'll start there. Now, what's very interesting about art is that in almost all situations, there is an artist and there is an audience. Okay, which means that art is a social activity. The production and consumption of art is a social activity, which means that art is social communication. And then we have to ask, what is the branch of science that deals with communication? Believe it or not, it's physics. Okay? It's not biology. Okay? Biology deals with cells and living systems and so on, but it doesn't deal with communication, really. It's not chemistry. Okay? Chemistry deals with chemicals. Okay? It's not quite mathematics. Okay? Mathematics is kind of the underlying basis for science. So it's physics. It's physics. Physics deals with communication. Now, the foundational work in the science of communication comes from the 1950s, where Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver, who were working at Bell Labs, discovered that information transfer and signals are subject to the same laws of physics as energy. Okay, and their discoveries are available in a book known as The Mathematical Theory of Communication. Okay, and you can buy that on Amazon, but I also think there's PDFs available online. Okay, so The Mathematical Theory of Communication is the book that set the foundation for all of modern digital communication. Okay, everything that we have from like JPEGs to MP3s to email to fiber optics, all of those things, it all can be traced back to the mathematical theory of communication. So, in the mathematical theory of communication, Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver put together a model for how communication works. It starts with an information source, which is then fed into a transmitter. The transmitter sends out a signal. The signal is received by a receiver. And then from the receiver, the message or signal can reach its destination. Okay? So this basic model of transmitter and receiver is applicable to aesthetic works, which use colors, shapes, chord progressions, and stories to transmit information from the artist to the audience. Therefore, works of art must be subject to the same laws of physics as other signals and transfers of energy. Okay? And so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of the implications of this. Okay? So if we take, what we've discussed about art so far and we plug it into this model, this is what we get. The information source is the heart and mind of the artist. Okay, the conceptual and preconceptual information that they want to convey through their art. The transmitter is the art, okay, which is also, the signal. The audience is the receiver, okay, in terms of like their eyes and ears and so on. Okay, the audience senses is the receiver, but the ultimate destination of the transmitted message, the artwork, is the heart and mind of the artist. Okay? As we discussed earlier, the artist is trying to communicate an emotion, a perspective, a worldview. Okay? Things that are difficult to put into words. They are trying to get something from their heart and their mind to the heart and mind of the audience. Okay? And they do this by way of art, which is interpreted through sense data. Okay? So information source, heart and mind, transmitter is the art, receiver is the audience and their senses, and the destination is the heart and mind of the audience. Now, something that's also quite interesting is that we have sayings when it comes to art and so on, such as, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Okay, and what do we actually mean by that? From the perspective of communication science and physics, what we're talking about here is something called compression. Compression. Okay? So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, what you're doing is you're taking 1,000 words and compressing it into a picture, which makes it a more efficient package. Okay? This is about efficient transfer of information. Okay? So, for example, someone could write a non-fiction book about their feelings and perspectives, or they could write a poem, or they could write a song. Okay? And those are essentially more efficient ways of communicating the same thing, because they are taking moods and emotions and worldviews and perspectives and compressing them into an artistic package. Okay, so for example, Ayn Rand is primarily a philosopher, but her most famous work is called Atlas Shrugged, which is a novel. Okay, and so what exactly was Ayn Rand doing here? Okay, the characters in Atlas Shrugged are a compression of values, personalities, and etc. Okay, so she basically used characters to compress her values and her worldview. Okay, same thing with events. Compression of real world events, stylized to emphasize relevant aspects. Dialogue mimics real life dialogue, and also is efficient because it advances the story while embodying different points of view. Okay, so Atlas Shrugged is essentially a compression of information, most of which is conceptual and deeper than language. Okay, so Ayn Rand used a story to communicate a philosophy and a worldview. Okay, and other people have done this in the past, like arguably Friedrich Nietzsche's most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a story. Okay, and so many people, including Ursula K. Le Guin, they describe reality and they convey worldviews and perspectives through stories. Okay, and even things like The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. Okay, it's a story. It's a parable. Okay, and even famous religious leaders, like one example would be Jesus. He communicated in parable and metaphor. Okay, and that obviously is quite popular. And why are those things so effective? Because they are compressing a whole bunch of information into an artistic package, okay, and conveying it to the audience. Okay, metaphor, story, parable, okay, songs, paintings, poems, right? These are compressions. It makes them more powerful. Now, one other thing that I should mention when it comes to the science of communication is that information is related to surprise mathematically. So if something is surprising, if something is new, it means that there's information there. Okay? As you might imagine, like, if what you're experiencing with your senses is exactly what you would expect to happen, it's kind of boring. You're not really learning anything. It's kind of same old, same old. But if something is new or novel, you've never seen it before, you've never heard it before, it contains information. Okay? It gives you an opportunity to learn and grow. Okay? And as I discussed in some of my other videos, there's an entire branch of neuroscience right now that talks about how the brain handles surprise. Okay? So now having gone through that science, we can look at the purpose of artistic expression again. Art allows us to express things that are difficult to put into words. Artists compress information through stories, colors, shapes, and music, and then transmit concepts and feelings to an audience. Through art, we are able to gain exposure to new ideas, new perspectives, and new feelings. Okay? This allows us to grow psychologically. It allows us to become more connected with each other. Okay? Because we're able to communicate all of these deep things. Okay? And so from the perspective of physics, art is a tremendous human technology. Okay? It allows us to communicate so many deep things in efficient and pleasing ways. Okay? It's genuinely incredible. Okay? And so, with that said, we can start asking questions about beauty. Okay? What makes something beautiful? What makes something beautiful? Okay? Now, from the perspective of physics, from the things that I've just discussed with you, okay, we know that art is essentially a signal transmission. Okay? I am taking concepts and emotions and worldviews and ideas. I am compressing them into an artwork, which is essentially a signal that I send to the audience. Okay? And so, when we're saying something is beautiful, what we're really saying is that this is a high quality signal. Okay? This is a high quality signal. Okay? Yes, beautiful also means aesthetically pleasing. It's pleasing, it's like, it's nice to look at, nice to listen to, etc. But something that's truly beautiful, okay? It's a high quality signal. It means that I've taken what's in my brain and in my heart, I've encoded it in a really good way, and I've sent it to someone else in a way that they can decode it and get the information in their heart and their brain. Okay? So when we talk about beauty, what we're really talking about is it's a high quality signal. Okay? So, what are some elements of true beauty? What are some elements of high quality signals? Okay? I'm just going to run you through them really quickly, and I'll give some examples where appropriate. Sincerity. Okay? If an artist is expressing what's in their heart and mind in an honest and authentic way, it means it is sincere. Okay? And this is essentially a prerequisite for any kind of meaningful, powerful signal. Okay? If the artist is just putting things together haphazardly, like taking a banana and taping it to a wall and calling it art, that's not really telling you anything about what's in their heart and mind. Like, other than, like, with using the banana on wall metaphor, or, like, example, because that's happened, all that's really telling you is that the artist is cynical, right? They're not, it's not really like a deep expression of, their emotions and so on. It's kind of like, like, I don't care, nothing means anything, whatever. So it's like, sincerity is an important part of art. Okay? Pleasing. So we've already talked about that in terms of something being nice to look at, nice to listen to, and so on. Okay, if it's pleasing, that makes it beautiful. Harmonious. Okay, and what I mean by that is it's able to be decoded by the audience. Okay? If someone creates a work of art and it's just too random and people don't know where they're going with it and they don't really know what it means, right? Which is like why some people don't like abstract art for that reason. It's kind of like, well, I don't really know what it means. It's just I don't know where they're going with that. Okay? So I happen to like abstract art, by the way. But harmonious means it's decodable. Okay, it means whatever I've put into this artistic signal, you are able to figure out what I mean. Okay, which, that is an element of a high quality signal. Okay, a signal needs to be decoded. Otherwise, it's just noise. Okay, legible. Okay, and by that, I mean it can be decoded accurately. Okay, so if I put something together, in terms of art, and everyone in the audience misunderstands it. They don't like they're able to decode some things, but they're not able to get the point of what I was trying to express. That's a problem. Okay? It means it's not as high a quality a signal as it could be. Okay? So legibility is also important. Meaningful. Okay? And by meaningful I mean high information value. The more that I am able to encode into my art and ship over, okay, the more meaningful it is. Okay, and therefore the more that you have to work with as an audience. Okay, so meaningful is important. New, okay, in terms of offering psychological growth. Okay, so beautiful art is typically something that you haven't quite seen before. Okay, it's like, oh wow, this is new. There's like maybe a new technique or something used in the art where it's like, okay, this is new. I've never really thought about this before. I've never really seen anything like this before. Never seen a TV show like this before. So new is related to beauty. Relevant, okay, in terms of offering useful information. Okay, innovative, novel use of medium. Okay, we'll talk about what that might mean. Okay, so someone who uses a certain kind of paint or instrument or whatever in a new way. Okay, that's innovative. And connective, facilitates social connection. Okay, so remember, art is a social communication activity. Okay, and art is also a signal, right? And so really good art facilitates connection between the artist and the audience, and ideally between audience members. Okay, which I'll give you an example of that in a second. So beautiful art is connective. It brings people together. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk you through some examples of this. Okay? Sincerity. Uh, my example for this is If I Had a Rocket Launcher by Bruce Cockburn. So Bruce Cockburn is a Canadian musician who's also a human rights activist, and he was in Guatemala back in the 80s, I think, where there were some human rights abuses happening, some atrocities, and he witnessed some of those atrocities. Okay, he witnessed civilians being murdered, and he wrote a song about it called If I Had a Rocket Launcher. And so obviously it's a bit of a dark song, it's a bit of an angry song or whatever, but it's sincere. It's sincere. If I had a rocket launcher, I would retaliate. That is sincerity. That is sincerity. Okay, and he put it into an artistic form. That's beautiful. Okay, in terms of something new, okay, there's a Netflix series known as Sense8, where the makers of The Matrix and Babylon 5 got together and made a sci-fi series. But I have never seen anything like this, personally. It's about 8 people from around the world becoming psychically connected. Okay, and I have never seen any story like this. I haven't seen any TV show like this or book like this. It is objectively new. Okay, it was using, essentially a television series to explore an entirely new, new kind of sci-fi story. Okay. Meaningful. One example would be, as I mentioned earlier, Pink Floyd's The Wall. Okay, a lot of people, especially when they're teenagers and so on, they find that very, very meaningful. Okay. Innovative. Okay. When it comes to innovative, I would use Avicii as an example. So Avicii was a electronic dance music artist. Okay, he was like a DJ and composer. And starting in 2013, he started to integrate live music, live performance, and acoustic instruments like guitars and so on into his songs and into his live performances. Up until that point, nobody was doing that. Nobody was doing that. Okay? And when Avicii started integrating live singing performances and different kinds of instruments into his music, it was a little bit controversial at the time because no one had ever done it before. Okay? And so that's innovative because he was using EDM music, okay, and he was doing EDM in a completely different way. Okay? No one had ever really done that stuff before. And so that is innovative. He was innovating on the medium. He was innovating on the medium. Okay? And to be a little self-referential for a moment, I'm going to cite my own work here. It's called Ticket to Heaven. Okay, so this is a non-fiction book. Okay? Technically, you could say it's a thesis. Okay? It's an academic thesis, I suppose. It's got 1,000 references, which makes it like a double PhD document. However, what I did with this book is I layered on an aesthetic layer to the nonfiction. Okay, like a lot of academic theses or academic works or whatever, they're rather dry. They don't have a lot of creativity to them. Okay, but what I did with Ticket to Heaven, for example, is I opened it up with pictures. Okay, I used song lyrics. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. I used quotes, okay, and AI generated art to set a vibe, okay, and then also every single chapter in here, it contains a reference, okay. Every single chapter is a reference or allusion, okay, like a cultural reference or whatever. And when you put this whole thing together, what it does is it tells a story, it communicates a vibe, and it's an academic work. Okay? And to be honest, I have not really seen anybody doing academic work in quite that way. Okay? So it's innovative. I am taking the medium of academic publishing or academic style publishing, and I'm innovating on it. I'm layering on art, emotion, song lyrics, quotes, references. Okay, I'm making it artistic. Okay, so that's innovating on the medium. And there's some other examples of that on my site. I've got a number of papers that I'm currently like re-releasing all of my academic work, like my papers and so on. And if you go to the research section of my website, you'll see that some of those are available. Okay, so that's an example of innovation. You know, traditional academic publishing, it's a little bit dry. It's not really as cool as it could be. So I innovated on the medium. Okay. So moving on, new, meaningful, and relevant. Okay, George Carlin and stand-up comics are an excellent example of this. Okay, so when you think of the medium of stand-up comedy, what exactly is happening? Okay, so people like George Carlin or Bill Burr or, I think Cat Williams is another example. Um, Dave Chappelle is another example. Essentially, what they're doing is they're getting up on stage and they're thinking out loud in a funny way. And they're connecting dots that people might not always connect. Okay, and it's a form of art, stand-up comedy. And essentially what they're doing is they're thinking on behalf of the audience, sharing their thoughts with the audience, and advancing the group consciousness. They are advancing the group consciousness by drawing attention to certain things, making funny connections, relieving tension, and making it safe to think about and talk about certain things. Okay, and the really good stand-up comedy, it's new, it's meaningful, and it's relevant. Okay, and it creates connection between everyone involved. Okay, because people are laughing together. Again, it makes it safe to talk about certain things or think about certain things in new ways. Okay, and stand-up comedy is a very socially valuable form of art. Okay, it's a socially valuable form of art. Now, when it comes to connection, okay, one example that I have is Star Trek. Okay, the Trekkie community. Okay, like if two people like Star Trek, Star Trek gives them a way to communicate certain things. Okay, like inside references and so on. It gives them a way to connect to each other. Okay, and so Star Trek is a great example of connective art. Okay. So yeah, those are some examples of truly beautiful, works of art, um, that are beautiful in specific ways, like being sincere, being innovative, being new and relevant, okay, or being connection facilitating, So, and those, as I mentioned, like those are all elements of signal transfer. All of those things are beautiful because they are an effective signal. Okay? So, yeah, like that is, my take on what beauty actually looks like. Okay? It has to do with the quality of the signal, the effect of the signal, and so on. Which is a lot more expansive than what we would traditionally associate with beauty, as in like, oh, it looks nice. Oh, that sounds pretty, right? It's more than that. It's more than that. Okay, you know, things like sincerity, meaning, relevance, usefulness, and so on. Like it's more than just looking or sounding pretty, you know. Now that is basically what I had to share when I went to the art gallery and I talked about this. That was basically what I had to share when it came to beauty. But I also talked a little bit about love and beauty, and this is I'm gonna break this out into a separate video, but I figured I'd mention this briefly, okay? Because the same laws of physics and the same principles of communication, they also apply to love. So beauty and love, like they're more related than we might think. Okay, like you might be aware that there are a lot of love songs and love poems and so on, and it's like, okay, like why is that? Why does so much of art have to do with love? Okay, so one answer to that is, ties back to this diagram that I had. Okay, love causes people to experience very deep emotions, very powerful emotions. Okay, and so love provides us with a deep wellspring of source material for art. Okay, so why are there so many love songs? Why are there so many love poems and so on? It's because the emotions related to that are very, very deep, and therefore those things result in powerful art, sincere art, okay, meaningful art, things that really express those emotions. So that's one reason why, okay, is the preconceptual territory is very rich. Now, interestingly, when you think about this model of communication that I talked about, okay, the artist has something in their heart and mind, they put it into art, ship it to the audience, which reaches the audience heart and mind. Okay, this also kind of works when it comes to love and relationships. Okay, because in a relationship, you don't just have an artist and an audience. You have two people who are artist and audience simultaneously. You have two people who are artist and audience simultaneously. Each one is the other's audience and the other's artist. Okay? And so essentially what you have in relationships is you have things like nicknames and inside jokes and other forms of rhapsodic communication. Okay, and what those indicate is a connection between two hearts and two minds. Okay? And these kinds of things develop spontaneously. They develop spontaneously as people become more deeply connected. Okay? Now, as I said, I'm going to break the love thing out into a separate video, but hopefully that helps talk a little bit about why love and beauty and art are so interrelated. Okay? Because they follow the same model of communication, just in a two-way form instead of one way from artist to audience. And I hope that also helps explain why, couples will often have nicknames and inside jokes and other forms of metaphorical communication. Okay, because it's more efficient, it's more powerful and meaningful. Okay, and so as connection grows between two people, those kinds of things happen. Okay, so anyway, that is what I was going to talk about in this video. I found this kind of stuff to be quite exciting when I stumbled on it and was thinking about it. When I started out as a researcher studying educational psychology, I never thought that I would, have stumbled on the science of aesthetics. But I'm glad that I followed all the rabbit holes that I did and thought about all the things that I did. Because, yeah, it led me to a really fun place. And to be honest, I'm now thinking for myself, right? Like, I want to make more art. Okay, so I've got a keyboard here. I've got some guitars there. If you look at my channel, I'm already releasing some music. I've been writing more poetry lately. Even my academic work, like my nonfiction work, as I said, like it's artistic in nature. Okay, and I think I want to do more of that. Like on my channel, I've got a lot of these kinds of things in terms of, essentially lectures. Okay, but I kind of want to be making more art. And technically, if I'm taking my own advice, from the things that I discussed in this video, it would be more efficient and probably more powerful and effective if I were to make art instead of make lectures, So maybe, that's what I need to be spending more of my time doing. Anyway, thank you very, very much for watching this video, if you watched the whole thing. Sound off in the comments, if you have any thoughts or questions. And, yeah, check out the rest of my channel. I've got a number of videos on psychology and neuroscience, somewhat related topics in terms of, communication and social activity and the physics of those things. So check that out if you've got the time. And yeah, thank you again. This lecture was a lot of fun to give at the art gallery, and yeah, it was fun kind of going through the same thing, in this medium as well. So hope you enjoyed it.